Chapter 1. The Man with the Torn Manuscript. The November rain painted London in hues of ash and silver. Under its steady drizzle, the city took on the stillness of an unfinished thought. Smoke rose lazily from chimneys, the street lamps burned, soft and yellow, and the Thames flowed like a ribbon of ink through the spine of the capital. Hercule Poirot sat at his window overlooking the square, one leg crossed precisely over the other, fingers steepled in thought. Outside, umbrellas bobbed past like beetles, oblivious to the drama that would soon begin. He had been idle for 3 weeks, an anomaly for the great detective. No new cases, no calls from Scotland Yard, just a quiet procession of tea, books, and introspection. Some might have found it restful. Poirot found it suspicious. And then, as if summoned by the sheer force of his curiosity, the bell rang. George, his ever-efficient valet, entered moments later. "A visitor, sir, an author, Mr. Sidney Grace, says it's urgent." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "An author? Bon, I shall receive him." A moment later, the man stepped in, a tall figure with a damp coat, nervous eyes, and a worn leather satchel clutched in both hands. He looked like someone who had come a very long way, without looking back. "Monsieur Grace," Poirot said, rising, "please do sit. You are troubled. I see it at once." Sidney hesitated, then sat on the edge of the armchair, as though afraid it might swallow him whole. I know of you, Monsieur Poirot," he said, voice low. "Everyone does. I wouldn't come if it weren't." He faltered. "I fear something terrible is going to happen." Poirot tilted his head. "Begin at the beginning, if you please." Sidney took a breath. "I'm a novelist. Thrillers, mostly. I've written 10 books, but my latest, well, it's different. More personal. It's called The Mournful Glass." Poirot gestured lightly. "And this mournful glass, it has shattered?" The man chuckled nervously. "Something like that. I finished the manuscript 2 weeks ago. My publisher loved it, said it was the best thing I'd ever done. They sent it to the typesetters. But then, something strange." He opened his satchel and withdrew a packet of papers, water-stained, slightly frayed. Poirot leaned forward as Sidney held up a single sheet. "This," he said, "was mailed to me. No note, no envelope, just this." Poirot took the page with gloved fingers. It was a typeset manuscript sheet, clearly from a publisher's print run. The typography was clean, margin justified, and near the top the chapter title read, Chapter 31, The Final Page. Poirot read silently. Then he frowned. The last sentence stopped mid-thought. He turned the key in the lock, only to see. And then nothing. No more words, no punctuation, no resolution. Worse still, the bottom of the page had been torn cleanly off. Poirot looked up. "And this was not done by you?" "Of course not," Sidney said quickly. "But when I checked the publisher's copy, Chapter 31 was gone. Not blank, missing. The master file on their end had been corrupted, and my own carbon copy burned in a house fire last week." Poirot's brow furrowed. "A fire? My study," Sidney said. "Faulty wiring, they said. Odd timing, wouldn't you agree?" Poirot leaned back, tapping his chin. "Indeed. So your manuscript, your final chapter, is entirely gone, except for this half-page, mailed mysteriously." Sidney nodded. And that's not all. A week ago, a woman I know, me editor Clara Fielding, disappeared, vanished from her flat. No forced entry, no note, just gone. Clara Fielding, Poirot repeated. A woman close to you? Sidney hesitated. We were close. Once. She edited all my work. She knew this manuscript inside and out. Poirot stood and walked slowly toward the fire. So, a vanished editor, a destroyed manuscript, and a final page ripped and mailed to you like a challenge. He turned back. Tell me, monsieur, what was in that final chapter? Sidney swallowed. A revelation. One that would shock anyone who read the rest. The entire novel is about a cold case. Fictional, of course. A man convicted of murder 20 years ago. But in the final pages, it's revealed the killer was someone else entirely. Someone who appeared earlier, someone no one suspected. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And this killer, was he inspired by a real person? Sidney paused. Yes. Poirot nodded slowly. So, this is not merely fiction, n'est-ce pas? You uncovered a truth. You wrote it down. And someone wants that truth erased. Sidney ran a hand through his hair. I didn't think it would matter. I changed names, places. It was supposed to be a catharsis, a clever ending. But now, Clara's gone. My work's in ruins, and I've begun to feel watched. Poirot glanced at the rain streaking the window. Did Clara have a copy? No. She read the final version weeks ago. She annotated it, in person. But the only existing copy was at the publisher's and my own, both gone. Poirot's gaze sharpened, except for this single page. He tapped it once. She turned the key in the lock, only to see. Poirot let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. Then he turned to Sidney with new intensity. You must not go home tonight. Sidney blinked. What? Why? Because someone believes your story is more than fiction. Someone who has already removed every trace of your manuscript, and may wish to remove you as well. Poirot rang for George. Prepare the guest room, he said. Mr. Grace will stay here under my protection, and tomorrow we begin. Sidney looked relieved, then frightened. Begin what? Poirot's voice was cool and steady. We are going to find your missing chapter. He held up the torn sheet, studying the sentence again. And if I am correct, monsieur, the last page of your book is not the only thing someone is trying to bury. Chapter 2. The Vanishing Editor. The next morning dawned cold and grey, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Mist clung to the rooftops of London like gauze, softening the edges of buildings and memory alike. Hercule Poirot wrote of buildings and memory alike. Hercule Poirot rose early, impeccably dressed in dove grey. He sat at his desk, sipping his tisane and reviewing his notes from the previous evening. Sidney Grace still slept in the guest room, having passed a restless night. Poirot, meanwhile, had been energized. The facts, though scant, had begun to form patterns, like stars emerging one by one in the dark. By 9 o'clock, he summoned George. Fetch me everything you can find on Mademoiselle Clara Fielding, he said. Editor, disappeared 1 week ago. We must begin where the trail ends. George nodded and left silently. Poirot turned his attention to the torn manuscript page once more. The single line haunted him. He turned the key in the lock, only to see the break was deliberate. Too perfect. Not a ragged accident, but the careful snipping of truth at the edge of revelation. Who would want to erase that, and why? By midday, George returned with a folder tucked neatly beneath his arm. Clara Fielding, age 36, he said, editor at Halberd Press for 12 years. Oxford educated, formerly a poet. Lived alone in a flat on Gresham Street. No signs of foul play at the scene. Police found the front door locked, no forced entry. They've chalked it up to a voluntary disappearance. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Voluntary? Bah! George continued. She was last seen at the company's autumn launch party. That was 8 days ago. No activity on her bank account or phone since. Who reported her missing? Her sister, Joanna Fielding, a solicitor. Said Clara never missed their Sunday dinners. When she failed to show, Joanna contacted the police. Poirot stood. Très bien. We will visit Mademoiselle Joanna at once. The Fielding residence was a narrow Georgian house in Bayswater, proper and unassuming. Joanna Fielding answered the door herself, dressed in navy and black, her manner as clipped as her speech. "Hercule Poirot?" she asked, eyeing his waxed moustache with guarded skepticism. "At your service, mademoiselle. May we come in?" She led them into a sitting room with severe decor and offered no tea. "I've told the police everything I know," she said. "They seem quite content to label Clara as missing by choice. I, however, am not. You were close. Fought often, but yes, we were close. We disagreed about nearly everything, but I knew her habits. She was punctual, orderly, consistent. For Clara to vanish without leaving a single note. Unthinkable." Was she troubled? Joanna frowned. Not in any way that would make her run. She had her moods, but she loved her work, especially that last novel, Sidney's. Said it was the most dangerous book she'd ever edited. Dangerous. Poirot sat forward. Did she elaborate? She didn't need to. She told me that the story was based on real events and real people. She was nervous, said publishing it might stir things better left settled. And yet she continued, yes, she believed in the truth, even if it was wrapped in fiction. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. May I ask, did she mention any names? People from the manuscript? Joanna hesitated. Only one. Someone from the publishing house. The owner, Rupert Halberd. Poirot blinked. Rupert Halberd, the man whose name adorns every dust jacket. Joanna nodded. Clara called him the patron of poisons. Said he had skeletons stacked taller than his awards. She suspected him of, well, she never finished the sentence, but she was afraid. Poirot stood. Then we must pay Monsieur Halberd a visit. Halberd Press was located in a stately building near Holborn, a converted townhouse brimming with the smell of paper, coffee, and ego. The receptionist tried to stall them, but Poirot's name still opened doors. They were ushered into a large office filled with Art Deco furniture and shelves of gleaming books. Rupert Halberd stood at the window, tall, silver-haired, with a carnivore's smile. "Ah, the famous detective," he said, turning. "Come to investigate a missing editor. I must say, that's more interesting than our usual business. Of late." Poirot inclined his head. "Monsieur Halberd, I am concerned for Mademoiselle Clara Fielding. It appears she vanished shortly after editing a most sensitive manuscript." Rupert's smile thinned. "If you're referring to Sidney Grace's novel, yes, I've heard the rumors. A shame, really. It was shaping up to be our biggest title this year. Do you believe her disappearance is connected to the manuscript? I believe Clara was sensitive, he said, selecting the word with care. She read too deeply, saw shadows in sunlight. Perhaps she needed a break. Poirot studied the man's eyes. Calm, confident, too confident. And the manuscript? Poirot asked. It vanished as well. Rupert shrugged. Tragedy. Corrupted files. The fire at Grace's house. And now, no final chapter. The book's dead in the water, unless Grace rewrites it. Poirot leaned in. But someone mailed him the last page, torn in half. Would you know who had access to the typesetter's proofs? Rupert frowned. Only Clara. And our senior typesetter, Mrs. Hargreaves. She's worked here 30 years. Loyal. To a fault. May I speak with her? I suppose, but she's hardly likely to be involved in anything sinister. Poirot smiled gently. One never knows, Monsieur Halbert. Sometimes even the quietest ink holds secrets. Mrs. Hargreaves was a small woman with calloused fingers and a strict bun. She looked up from her desk as Poirot approached. You'll forgive me, madam, Poirot said, but I must ask. A final page from Sidney Grace's book was mailed anonymously. Did you notice anything odd about the proofs? She pursed her lips. Yes, I remember that chapter. Odd it was, intense. I set it, but when I came in the next morning, the galley was gone. The file had been erased from the system. I asked Clara about it, and she just said, it's taken care of. Taken care of? She looked frightened. Said it was best if we pretended the chapter never existed. Poirot nodded slowly. Thank you, madam. That is all. He turned to leave. He noticed a small note pinned to the board above her desk. A line of poetry. What's written in ink may still bleed in the dark. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He had heard that line before. In one of Clara Fielding's earliest poems, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot found Sidney pacing. I've remembered something, Sidney said. Something odd. Something, Sidney said. Something odd. A man. He came to one of my readings last year. Not a fan. Said something strange before leaving. Careful what truths you bind in fiction. Some truths don't stay dead. I didn't think much of it until now. Poirot's brow furrowed. Do you recall his name? No, but he had a limp left leg and a scar on his jaw. Poirot looked toward the window. Outside the mist was thickening again. A man with a limp, a missing editor, a vanished final page, and secrets someone once buried. He turned back to Sidney. I must ask, monsieur, what exactly was the inspiration for your final chapter? Sidney hesitated. I was researching an old case, an unsolved murder from 20 years ago. A journalist found dead under suspicious circumstances. It was ruled a robbery, but I found something, a link to a prominent name. Whose name? Sidney looked Poirot in the eye. Rupert Halbert. Chapter 3. Ink and Alibis. The weight of Rupert Halbert's name hung in the air like fog in the room. Poirot sat in stillness, fingertips pressed together, watching Sidney Grace fidget across the rug. You say, monsieur, that this man, the most powerful publisher in London, is connected to an unsolved murder. Sidney nodded. Yes, the victim's name was Edward Linnell, investigative journalist. He was found dead in 1906 in an alley in Whitechapel. bludgeoned. The police said it was a robbery. Wallet and watch gone. Case closed in 3 days. Poirot's brows lifted. 3 days is a suspiciously tidy window for a messy death. Exactly. But when I was researching for the book, I came across some of Linnell's unpublished notes, scans in an old archive. He was working on an exposé about corruption in the early days of London's publishing boom. Vanity presses, money laundering, political favours. And Halberd? Sidney nodded. He wasn't a publisher back then. Not officially. He worked under the name Richard Lorne, an alias. He was a fixer, quietly arranging print runs for political pamphlets that skirted legality. Linnell was close to exposing him, and then dead. Poirot paced to the fireplace. "And you used this in your book?" "I fictionalized it, changed names, but the core of it, the final chapter, laid it bare, that the man behind the events was still alive, still powerful, still dangerous." Poirot turned. So this chapter would ruin Halberd? Sidney looked grim. If readers made the connection, yes. If someone had the original chapter, they could trace it back. And that's why it had to vanish. Poirot tapped his lip. And Clara Fielding knew the truth? She edited it line by line. She knew every word, and now she is gone. There was a silence. Then Poirot, eyes flashing with decision, reached for his hat. "We must visit the archive." The British Library's archives on Euston Road were cavernous and still. In the back corner of the Special Collections room, Poirot and Sidney were granted access to Box 42 ELN, a thin cardboard file containing the recovered notes of Edward Linnell. Inside, handwritten pages, faded photographs, and 3 carbon copies of typed exposé drafts. Poirot leafed through them with care, lips tightening. Then there it was, a typewritten paragraph, its header reading, "The Lorne Connection." Richard Lorne is not merely a pseudonym, but the mask behind which power hides. This man is embedded in the London publishing elite, present at meetings, managing funds, and silencing critics. If what I suspect is true, he is not just a player. He is the puppet master. Poirot passed the sheet to Sidney. "This Lorne, it is Halberd, without question." Sidney nodded. "Compare signatures, addresses, dates. It's him. I followed the trail myself, piece by piece." Poirot's gaze darkened. "Then we must not underestimate Monsieur Halberd. He silenced Linnell. He may now be attempting to silence you. And Clara Fielding." Sidney swallowed. "So what now?" "Now we find the original chapter. Somewhere, monsieur, someone must have a copy. A printer, a reader, a proof. These things leave traces. And Hercule Poirot, he does not leave a single page unturned. Their next stop was Halberd Press's print facility in Wapping. Unlike the polished Holborn office, this building was all metal and ink and old ghosts. Machines clattered. The smell of paper was thick, and ink smudged the air like soot. Poirot and Sidney met with the foreman, a stooped man named Ernie Drake, who smelled of cigarettes and glue. Chapter 31. Drake said, scratching his neck. "We run proofs weekly. If it was sent, it was printed. But the final pages, those are shredded daily, if not archived." "Not archived?" Poirot asked. "Only if flagged by editorial. Clara Fielding flagged some. Oddly, the last week she was here." Poirot's eyes glinted. Where are those vials kept? In the annex, locked drawer. But if Clara flagged it, they moved quickly. In the annex office, Drake unlocked the drawer with a small brass key. Inside, 3 flat boxes, each labeled by date. Poirot slid open the one from the week before Clara disappeared. At the bottom, carefully folded, a proof with a handwritten note on top. Keep for verification. Author uncertain about final phrasing. C.F. Poirot opened it. Chapter 31. Intact. He read silently, Sidney over his shoulder. It began innocuously, but by the halfway point it shifted. The truth, long buried, returned like a cold wind. He had thought himself forgotten, but she had found the name, and she knew. Richard Lawn, she whispered, and he froze. Poirot nodded slowly. Mon Dieu, this is enough to ruin a man. Sidney looked pale. It was supposed to be art, but the truth bled through. Poirot folded the page gently. Now, we must protect this, and use it to find Clara Fielding. That evening, back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot made 2 calls, one to Inspector Japp, the other to Joanna Fielding. Within the hour, Joanna arrived, eyes wide at the sight of the manuscript in Poirot's hand. "You found it?" she asked. Poirot nodded. "Your sister protected it. She knew its value and its danger. Its value and its danger." Joanna reached for the pages, but Poirot pulled them back. "Not yet. First, tell me, was Clara ever threatened?" Joanna looked down. "Once, last year. She came home shaking. Said someone had slipped a note in her bag. At work. What did it say?" Joanna recited slowly. "Fiction is safest when it stays fiction. Tread carefully, Miss Fielding." "She never told me who it came from." Poirot rose and walked to the fire. "Mademoiselle Fielding uncovered something real. Too real. She vanished not out of madness, but strategy." Joanna frowned. "You think she's alive?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, in hiding, until it was safe." "And now that you have the chapter?" Poirot tapped it once. "She will return, but we must make it known, to draw her out and to bring Halberd into the open." That night, Poirot penned a letter, carefully composed, signed anonymously, and delivered by George to Halberd's personal assistant. It read, "The truth survives. The final page exists. The fiction will become fact. You have one chance to answer before the chapter is published." Poirot knew Halberd would receive it by morning. Then he turned to Sidney. "Tomorrow," he said, "we meet Inspector Japp. The case of Edward Linnell will be reopened. The story you wrote will help solve a real murder." Sidney looked overwhelmed. "And Clara?" Poirot's gaze softened. "She will hear of this. She will come." He placed the manuscript into a locked drawer. "And when she does," he said softly, "we will ask her the most important question." "What's that?" Poirot closed the drawer with a quiet click. Who else knew the truth? Chapter 4. The Ghost Editor. The next morning, the fog that had hung over London for days lifted just enough to allow a weak golden light to slant through the windows of Whitehaven Mansions. Hercule Poirot stood at the breakfast table, meticulously slicing his croissant. Across from him, Sidney Grace scanned the morning papers, his eyes widening. "Front page of the Literary Gazette," he said. "Lost manuscript found. The final chapter that could destroy a publisher. They've printed a teaser. You planted this. Poirot looked smug. Mais oui, it was time to stir the waters. Now, those who believe the chapter destroyed will panic, and those in hiding may begin to resurface. Sidney frowned. Won't Halberd come after us? Him, Poirot said calmly. He is clever, but he is not subtle. I have invited him to expose himself. Now, we wait. He sipped his tisane. Then, as if on cue, the telephone rang. George answered, then turned to Poirot. A woman on the line. She won't give her name, but she says he knows the page still exists. I saw it in the paper. He won't stop now, but I'm ready to speak. Tonight. Alone. Poirot stood at once. Ask for the place and time. George nodded. She says the old printing house in Shoreditch. 10 o'clock. Tell Poirot to come alone. Poirot turned to Sidney. Mademoiselle Fielding. It must be. Are you sure it's not a trap? I welcome the possibility, Poirot said, eyes gleaming. But I do not think it is. Clara Fielding is a woman of strategy. She has chosen her moment. That night, the streets of Shoreditch were nearly empty, lit by flickering gas lamps and the occasional passing tram. Poirot arrived precisely at 10, overcoat buttoned, hat square on his head. The abandoned printing house loomed in the dark, its windows broken, the sign faded. He stepped inside. The scent of old ink and rust still lingered. Shadows clung to every corner. Then, a whisper, Monsieur Poirot. From behind a stack of crates, Clara Fielding stepped into view. She wore a long wool coat, hair pulled back, face thinner than in her photographs, but her eyes were alert, unmistakably her. Poirot bowed. Mademoiselle, I am most relieved to see you. Clara smiled faintly. You've been looking. Indeed. The truth, it is like a pressure, building, swelling, until it must be released. You've vanished, mademoiselle. Why? Clara leaned against a crate. I knew what I was editing, Poirot. Sidney's book. It wasn't just fiction. It was the truth with new clothes. That final chapter, if it went to print, it would bring down powerful men, one in particular. Rupert Halberd. She nodded. He found out I'd flagged the chapter for archiving. I don't know how, but 2 days later I was followed. There were phone calls. I even saw someone standing outside my building late at night. I realized then I had 2 choices: disappear or end up like Edward Linnell. Poirot stepped closer. Why now? Why contact me? Because I saw the story today, and because I knew you'd be behind it. Halberd won't stop, but you might. Poirot pulled a small envelope from his coat. We found the original proof in Halberd Press's archive. You were clever to flag it. She let out a breath. Then it still exists. It does, and with your help, we can use it. But you must go to the police. I will, she said. But there's more you need to know. Rupert wasn't working alone. There's someone inside the press, someone who helped erase the files, intercept the mail, and likely warned him about me. Poirot's eyes gleamed. An accomplice. Have you a name? Clara hesitated. No, but I overheard a phone call. Before I disappeared, Rupert was speaking to someone. He said, make sure the typesetter never speaks. That must be Mrs. Hargreaves. Poirot stiffened. Mon Dieu, if she is in danger! He turned at once, stepping back into the cold night. The next morning, Poirot and Inspector Japp stood in the small, tidy flat of Mrs. Hargreaves. The room was still, too still. She didn't report for a workless morning, Japp said. We came straight here. Poirot walked slowly towards the armchair. A cup of cold tea, a scarf half knitted, but the woman was gone. Struggle? Poirot asked. No signs. Door was locked from the inside, but the window's been forced. Poirot nodded grimly. They took her. Japp cursed under his breath. Why? She had access, Poirot said. She typeset the final chapter. Final chapter. She may have made a copy, or worse, remembered it. Halberd wants to eliminate every thread. Japp turned to the constable. Send out a notice. Search the rail stations. We need to find her fast. Poirot, meanwhile, walked to the mantel. A photo of Mrs. Hargreaves with a younger woman, daughter, perhaps. Below it, a piece of paper lay partially hidden behind a clock. Poirot gently pulled it free. It was a carbon copy, the final page of The Stranger's Secret. Mon ami, he said to Japp, we have another piece of the puzzle. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Clara joined Sidney and Poirot. The tension was thick. So what now? Sidney asked. Poirot clasped his hands. Now, we set the trap. He laid out his plan. Clara would return to Halberd Press. She would request a meeting with Rupert under the pretense of negotiating the book's future. Poirot and Japp would be nearby, recording the exchange. Sure, he confesses even in part. We can act, Poirot said. And if he doesn't, Clara asked, then we force his hand. He turned to George. Prepare the papers. We will leak the full chapter tonight. Halberd will know he cannot bury it. He will grow reckless. The next afternoon, Clara sat in Rupert Halberd's office. Poirot, Japp, and two plainclothes officers were positioned in a van outside, listening through a wire. Rupert leaned back in his chair, smiling. So the ghost editor returns, he said. Was the attic cold, Clara? She didn't rise to the bait. I've come to offer you a choice. Do go on. You pull your influence back. Let the book be published. Let the truth out. Or I release what I know to the press, to the police. Halberd's smile vanished. You're bluffing. No. You know I'm not. There was a long silence. Then he stood. You think you understand the game, Clara. You don't. People like me, we write the endings. Not this time. Halberd leaned in, voice low and dangerous. I've buried deeper threats than you. If you think this will end me. The door burst open. Poirot entered first, with Japp behind him. Bonsoir, Monsieur Halberd, Poirot said, eyes alight. I believe that is quite enough fiction for one day. Halberd froze. Japp stepped forward. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit obstruction of justice, attempted coercion, and possibly more. Halberd laughed bitterly. You've got nothing. Ah, but we have everything, Poirot said. A proof, a recording, and a witness who lived to tell the tale. Halberd's mask cracked, just slightly. I should have finished it myself, he muttered. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And you nearly did. But words, monsieur, they are like seeds. You cannot always control what they grow into. That night, Clara Fielding watched from a distance as Rupert Halberd was led into a police car. Poirot stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "You have been brave, mademoiselle," he said, "and precise." She smiled faintly. "Thank you. I never wanted to vanish. I just wanted the truth to matter." Poirot bowed slightly. "It did. It does." She turned to leave, but stopped. "Oh, one last thing." She handed him a note. "Mrs. Hargreaves is safe. She called me. She escaped. Said someone warned her at the last moment. Someone from inside." Poirot unfolded the note. It read, "Not all stories end on the last page. Some begin there." He smiled. The mystery was far from over. Chapter 5. Shadows in the Stacks. The following day dawned crisp and cold, with a silence that seemed oddly out of place in a city that rarely slept. At Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot sat in contemplative silence, staring out the window at the pigeons on the ledge. Across from him, Sidney Grace was pacing, manuscript in hand, worry etched into every furrow of his brow. "I should be relieved," Sidney muttered. "Halbert is in custody, Clara is safe, and the chapter is intact. But something doesn't sit right." Poirot turned from the window. "Ah, but you are correct to feel unease, mon ami. We have arrested a man, yes, but not solved the mystery, Itinteo." Frowned. "What do you mean?" Poirot stood and retrieved a folder from his writing desk. He opened it to reveal copies of the chapter, Clara's handwritten notes, and a list of editorial staff from Halberd Press. "You see, the sabotage of your manuscript required coordination." Clara disappeared before she could leak the truth, but someone else continued the work. Files erased, backup copies destroyed, witnesses threatened. Halberd could not do all this alone. There is someone else, someone within the press, or perhaps above it. Sidney stared. Above it? Poirot nodded slowly. "Consider. Halberd used the alias Richard Lorne in 1906, but the political propaganda he funded, was it his idea? Or was he merely a facilitator for greater forces?" Before Sidney could answer, George appeared at the door. "Sir," he said, "a messenger just arrived from the British Library. Special collections. They've uncovered a letter, unsigned, dated 1906. It mentions both Edward Linnell and Richard Lorne. The librarian thought you might want to see it." Poirot took the envelope with a flicker of excitement. He opened it carefully, eyes scanning the yellowed paper. "We cannot allow Linnell's report to see print. If Lorne cannot handle it, I shall. We built this institution on silence. Let's book, no ink spill on our names." Poirot looked up. "Mon Dieu, this is no ordinary conspiracy. This is legacy. And institutions do not die easily." By late afternoon, Poirot and Sidney returned to the British Library. Dr. Alice Merton, the senior archivist, met them in a reading room, clearly agitated. "I think you'll want to see this," she said, placing a bundle of files on the table. "It appears Halberd Press was only one of several imprints used in the early 20th century to push political agendas, hidden behind shell companies. Many of the names are still active today, in the arts, the press, even Parliament." Poirot leaned in. "Who managed these networks?" Alice tapped a name at the bottom of a 1906 ledger. "The Darnley Foundation." Sidney blinked. "That's a literary charity. Funds libraries and translation programs." Alice nodded grimly. "And more. And translation programs." Alice nodded grimly. And more. Look closer. Poirot studied the page. Several grants bore familiar names, small journals that vanished after a single issue, publishing houses that dissolved just before libel suits. It was a financial maze, designed to lose anyone who followed. Mon Dieu, Poirot whispered. They have erased truth with ink and paper. With money, Sidney said. So Halbert was just one arm of something larger. What do we do? Poirot's eyes gleamed. We pull another thread. That evening, Poirot hosted Clara Fielding at Whitehaven Mansions for tea. She looked stronger now, more present, though her eyes still searched every corner of the room before sitting. I remember something, she said after a long silence. Just before I vanished, I received a parcel. No return address. Inside was a single page. Not from the book, but a letter. It was from someone who claimed to have known Linnell. It warned me to stop, but also included a name, Elspeth Darnley. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Of the Darnley Foundation. Clara nodded. I'd never heard of her before, but when I searched for the name, nothing came up. No photographs, no records, just donation reports signed with her initials. E.D. Poirot stood. Then it is time we pay a visit to the Foundation. The offices of the Darnley Foundation sat on a quiet street near Regent's Park. It was an elegant townhouse, all marble, floors and dark wood. A secretary met Poirot and Sidney in the foyer. Elspeth Darnley does not take meetings, she said curtly. Please inform her, Poirot said smoothly, that Hercule Poirot does not ask twice. A long pause. Then, surprisingly, she relented. Very well. 5 minutes. Do not touch anything. They were led into a drawing-room where every surface gleamed with polished restraint. A moment later, a woman entered, tall, in her 60s, with silver hair twisted in a bun. Her eyes were sharp, but her smile sharper. Monsieur, she said, you've come to talk about the past. Poirot inclined his head. Madame Darnley, we believe you knew Edward Linnell. A flicker crossed her face. Surprise, swiftly, suppressed. I knew many writers, she said. Some were dangerous with their pens. Sidney stepped forward. And you helped silence them? She turned to Poirot. You found the chapter, haven't you? The one your friend wrote? Poirot didn't answer. He only watched her. Elspeth smiled again. Then you already know. Rupert was reckless, impatient. The Foundation built its strength through discretion. Not threats, not corpses. Yet a corpse there was, Poirot said quietly. Linnell, his murder has your signature, if not your name. Elspeth's eyes hardened. No, he was silenced by fools, not by me. Poirot leaned forward. Then why hide? Why send threats to Clara Fielding? I didn't, she snapped. In fact, I warned her. I tried to stop Rupert, but the machine was already in motion. Poirot nodded. Then help us. Expose it. Tear it down. Elspeth Darnley considered him a long time. Then she said softly, I will give you one name. The one who revived the lawn operation 5 years ago. The man behind the new veil. She took a pen and wrote on a card. Poirot read it. Ambrose Langley. Poirot looked up, stunned. Langley. But he owns half the papers in London. And he owns people too, Elspeth said, including your Inspector Japp. Poirot froze. He receives reports, yes, she said, but he filters what reaches the public. Ask yourself, why was the Linnell case closed in 3 days? Who decided there was no investigation? She stood. Langley was the ghost all along. Rupert was only the ink. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot paced furiously. I should have seen it, he muttered. Langley has positioned himself as a neutral observer, a patron of arts. But he is the final page, the one no one reads. Sidney sat, stunned. So, what do we do? Poirot turned to him, calm settling over him like snow. We write a new ending. But to do that, we must outwit the editor. Reached for the telephone. George, he said, get me Clara. We have a story to publish. The true one. Chapter 6. The Final Sentence. The rain began before dawn, drumming softly on the rooftops of London like a warning. Inside Whitehaven Mansions, Hercule Poirot sat at his writing desk, a small envelope resting beneath his fingertips. It bore no return address, only a single letter pressed in wax. L. George, ever discreet, entered with a tray of breakfast, placing it silently before his employer. But Poirot waved it away. Merci, George, but I find this morning I cannot eat. George eyed the envelope. Another threat, sir. Poirot peeled back the wax. Inside, a single sheet of parchment bore the typed words, You speak of truth like it is eternal. But truth is not a page, it is the editor. Burn the chapter, or be buried beneath it. Poirot folded the letter carefully and slipped it into a drawer. He turned to George, his voice low but resolute. Prepare my coat. We go to the Courier. At the Courier offices near Fleet Street, the editor-in-chief, Harold Leighton, looked up in alarm as Poirot entered, flanked by Clara Fielding and Sidney Grace. Poirot, Leighton stammered. What are you? We are here, Poirot said, calmly, to publish the truth. Sidney dropped a leather-bound folio on the editor's desk. It contained the full manuscript of The Stranger's Secret, including the suppressed final chapter, now annotated with footnotes and references, tying the narrative to real-life political figures and publishing networks. Rupert Halberd among them. Leighton glanced through the pages, blanching as he read. This will cause chaos. These are powerful men, Poirot. Ambrose Langley practically owns the air we breathe. Poirot leaned forward. Then let us clear the air. Leighton hesitated. If I print this, I'll be sued before the ink dries. Clara stepped in. But if you don't, it dies again, just like Linnell. That name, Linnell, hung in the air like a ghost. Leighton looked at Poirot, like a ghost. Leighton looked at Poirot. You'll guarantee me protection. No, Poirot said. I will guarantee you history. By noon, the Courier's editorial team was in motion. Clara and Sidney oversaw the printing room personally, ensuring every plate was set, every line accurate. The lead headline read, The Page They Tried to Erase, How a Century-Old Murder Still Shapes Our Literature. In the middle of it all, Poirot stood calm, composed, but inwardly coiled with tension. The trap was baited, but would Langley bite? He didn't have to wait long. At 3 o'clock, Poirot received a telegram at Whitehaven Mansions. A single sentence, tonight, at Langley House. Come alone, or the truth ends here." Poirot stared at the words a long moment, then folded the paper and reached for his hat. "George," he said, "if I do not return by morning, tell Japp everything. Clara has the records." George frowned. "Sir, is it wise to go alone?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Wisdom has never solved a murder. But courage, that has its uses. Langley House sat at the edge of Hampstead Heath, more fortress than home. Tall hedges surrounded it, and discreet cameras blinked in the hedgerows. Poirot walked the gravel path with deliberate calm, his footsteps echoing louder than they should. Inside, he was greeted not by servants, but by Langley himself. Tall, lean, with a perfectly groomed beard and sharp grey eyes, Langley looked more philosopher than media mogul. "Poirot," he said, voice like smoke, "the last reader of a dying manuscript." Poirot did not smile. "Your messages lack subtlety, Monsieur Langley." Langley gestured to a leather chair before a fireplace. "Let's not pretend. You've made your move. You've stirred ghosts. But I control the presses that define truth in this country. Your exposé will vanish beneath scandal and noise." Poirot sat. "Perhaps. But you are here, speaking to me because you are afraid." Langley chuckled. "Afraid? I'm simply editing." He stepped toward the fireplace, where a pile of newspapers sat. One bore the headline from the Courier. Langley picked it up. "I can end this," he said, "right now. The witnesses vanish, the documents discredited. Even you, Poirot, will be made to look mad." Poirot said quietly, "Like Edward Linnell?" Langley's expression darkened. He was a fool. He thought truth was eternal. But it isn't. It must be curated. Truth without discipline is chaos. "You mistake obedience for order," Poirot said, "and silence for peace." Langley moved to a drawer, pulled out a pistol. "You're a stubborn man, Poirot." "But everyone has a last page." Poirot did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small transmitter. "I believe," he said, "you just wrote yours." From outside came the screech of tires. Seconds later, the front door burst open. Inspector Japp entered with 2 constables, weapons drawn. "Ambrose Langley," Japp barked. "Put the gun down." Langley hesitated, but only for a moment. Then he smiled bitterly and set the pistol on the mantelpiece. "Bravo, Poirot!" A final twist. Poirot stood. "You wrote your narrative for decades, Monsieur Langley. But today the reader writes back." By morning, London was ablaze with headlines. Langley arrested in publication. Scandal, century-old murder linked to modern press mogulhood. Truth in print, how Poirot unraveled a literary cover-up. "We built this institution on silence." Inside the Darnley Foundation file sat. The Courier building. Clara watched the presses run, her expression unreadable. Sidney stood beside her. "It's finally out there. Every word." Clara nodded. "But words are only the beginning. There'll be backlash, lawsuits, and worse." Poirot arrived moments later, straightening his gloves. "You are right, mademoiselle," he said. "The truth does not end the fight. It only begins it." He looked at the first printed copy of the paper, then handed it to Clara. "For Edward Linnell," he said softly, "and for all those whose voices were erased." She took it, nodding. "Will Langley stand trial?" Sidney asked. Japp had appeared behind them, looking tired but satisfied. "He will. The charges will stick, and Darnley's legacy is collapsing under the weight of her own archives." Poirot turned to the others. "Then this chapter at least is complete." He paused, then added with a small smile, "But I am not convinced there is not one more page." That evening, Poirot returned to Whitehaven Mansions. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed and gleaming. George had lit the fire, and the familiar scent of bergamot hung in the air. Poirot sat, reached for a small parcel that had arrived while he was out. It contained a single lily, and a card to Hercule Poirot for writing the truth when others erased it. Edie Poirot smiled faintly and placed the flower in a vase beside the final page of The Stranger's Secret. Then he leaned back, fingers steepled. Sometimes, he thought, the most dangerous stories were not those left untold, but those unfinished. And now, at last, this one had an ending. Chapter 7. The Ink That Remains. The trial of Ambrose Langley began with more fanfare than even Poirot expected. Reporters crowded the steps of the Old Bailey, and newspapers spilled ink by the gallon over every sordid detail. The public, once apathetic to literary affairs, now buzzed with scandal and speculation. Clara Fielding's face was splashed across magazine covers. Sidney Grace's book shot to the top of bestseller lists, though it was the unpublished chapter, finally printed in the Courier, that became the true literary phenomenon. But amid the rising tide of justice, Poirot remained uneasy. "I do not trust peace that arrives too quickly," he told George one morning, while trimming a single rose in a crystal vase. George, dusting nearby, looked up. Sir. The conspiracy unraveled too neatly. Langley gave up names, records, even financial trails without resistance. A man so practiced in deception does not fold from pride. He does so only when there is something left to protect. Poirot paused. For someone, later that afternoon, Poirot visited the Darnley Foundation's sealed archive in Westminster. After Langley's arrest, the charity had gone into receivership. The building stood hollow, emptied of staff but still echoing with past whispers. Inside, he was met by Dr. Alice Merton, who was now overseeing the archival transition. "I thought you might return," she said, unlocking a side door marked Restricted Holdings. She led him to a chamber lined with steel drawers and ancient filing cabinets. "This is where we found the letters linking Langley and Halbert to Edward Linnell," she said. "But there's more. I didn't want to release it publicly without your review." She handed Poirot a slim dossier labeled ED, 1903-1907. Inside, correspondences between Elspeth Darnley and Rupert Halbert. But what struck Poirot was not what was written, but what wasn't. Several pages bore faint outlines where text had once been but was now missing, deliberately removed with a razor blade. Poirot's brow furrowed. Someone came after. Alice nodded. The removals happened recently, perhaps even during Langley's arrest. Poirot turned the last page. A water stain had blurred a signature, but under careful light he could still make out the initials. CF stared. Clara Fielding, That evening Poirot summoned Sidney Grace to his flat. They spoke quietly over the gentle tick of the mantel clock. "I fear, mon ami," Poirot said, "that our dear Mademoiselle Fielding may not be the mere victim she appeared." Sidney paled. "That's absurd. She was nearly killed for that manuscript." Poirot tapped the dossier. "But she was also the only person, aside from Halbert himself, with access to the original drafts. And she worked at Halbert Press before Sidney ever arrived." Sidney's mouth fell open. "You're saying she forged the final chapter?" "No," Poirot said. "Worse, she revised it." He opened the Courier's reprint and produced a second copy. One Clara had submitted directly. Compare the phrasing. In the original, Linnell writes of institutions of ink and silence. But in Clara's version, it becomes empire built of quiet ink and louder obedience. She has elevated the language, stylized it, modernized it. Sidney frowned. That could be editorial refinement. Or controlled narrative, Poirot said. What if Clara was not simply a survivor, but the curator of how the truth was finally told? The next day, Poirot visited Clara. She greeted him warmly, offering coffee and an armchair in her modest Bloomsbury flat. The room smelled of lilies and old books. On the wall was a framed newspaper clipping, the Courier headline, next to a photograph of Poirot. "You look troubled," she said, pouring coffee. Poirot set his cup aside. "Mademoiselle Fielding, why did you alter Edward Linnell's words?" Froze for half a second, so brief it might have gone unnoticed. But not by Poirot. "I didn't," she said softly. "I adapted them. His manuscript was disjointed, broken. I restored it for clarity." Poirot's gaze did not waver. "Did you, by chance, remove a page from the Darnley archives?" Clara stood abruptly. "What are you implying?" "I am not implying, mademoiselle. I am observing. You are too articulate, too precise. You predicted Langley's fall even before I suspected him. And your supposed disappearance, there were no ransom notes, no signs of violence. I believe you went into hiding, not out of fear, but to prepare." Clara's jaw tightened. Poirot pressed on. "What was the real purpose of your version of the chapter? What did you leave out?" She moved to the window, staring out at the rain. "You don't understand," she said. "Linnell's original chapter. Yes, it exposed Halbert, but it also implicated others. Names that would ruin innocent families, start lawsuits that could collapse libraries and universities. I didn't destroy his words, Poirot. I preserved them, responsibly." Poirot stood. "But you also protected the legacy of those institutions, even as you claimed to unveil them." She turned to him, eyes blazing. "Would you rather I let the world burn in pursuit of a perfect truth? I gave people enough to wake up." Poirot looked at her with a mix of sorrow and admiration. "You are not a criminal," he said, "but you are not entirely honest either." She sighed. "Is anyone when history's at stake?" Poirot returned to Whitehaven with heavy thoughts. The mystery of the last page, it seemed, was not about a murder, nor even a manuscript. It was about control, of truth, of memory, of narrative. That night he wrote a letter, to be read upon my passing. There is no such thing as a whole story, only pieces arranged by those brave or foolish enough to choose which ink remains. I do not judge Mademoiselle Fielding, nor do I absolve her. I simply note that she, too, wrote her chapter. Hercule Poirot. He folded it, sealed it in an envelope, and tucked it inside the poetry book on his desk. Days later, Clara's version of The Stranger's Secret was released in hardcover. It bore her introduction, Sidney's name as co-author, Poirot's blessing in the back cover notes. It became an instant classic. And yet, somewhere beneath the words, Poirot knew, another version of the truth remained. A version hidden not by villains, but by those trying to make sense of a complicated world. In the final pages of his journal, Poirot wrote only one line. Sometimes the greatest mystery is who gets to write the ending. Chapter 8. Beneath the cover, London had entered one of those strange fog-draped weeks where the sky hovered somewhere between smoke and silence. Hercule Poirot observed the city from his armchair as he sipped a tisane steeped with thyme and orange peel. The fire crackled softly in the grate. It was peaceful, but not quiet, not in his mind. A storm of thought stirred behind those eyes. The trial of Ambrose Langley was nearing its conclusion, and the courtroom had become a theatre of self-preservation. Witnesses came forward in droves, each one sacrificing another to shave off their own guilt. But even as Poirot watched Langley squirm beneath the scrutiny of the Crown prosecution, something troubled him. I cannot shake the feeling, he muttered aloud, that the play has ended, but the actors remain on stage. George, polishing silver in the corner, raised an eyebrow. The final curtain, sir? Poirot nodded, then placed down his cup. Oui, but I suspect there is still an epilogue. A ridicule. Scotland Yard. Inspector Japp greeted Poirot with a rare weariness. The Langley trial had occupied half his department. He'll be convicted, Japp said, motioning for Poirot to sit. No doubt about that. But the more we dig, the more things we find that don't make sense. He handed Poirot a list. These are the names Langley funded through ghost accounts. A few were expected, editors, lawyers, but look at this one. Poirot scanned the paper, then froze. Eek. Cartwright, 3,000 Joel, quarterly since 2014. Poirot narrowed his eyes. Eleanor Cartwright. I've seen this name before. She was listed in the estate documents of Rupert Halbert. Japp nodded. Halbert's personal archivist. Quiet type, barely appeared in press records. Poirot stood. We must find her. She is the next page. Eleanor Cartwright lived in a flat above a rare bookshop in Clerkenwell. The door bore no number, only a brass letter slot and a faint scent of lavender. Poirot knocked gently. After a moment, the door creaked open. A thin, grey-haired woman in spectacles stood behind it. Her gaze sharpened as she saw him. "You're him," she said. "The detective." Poirot inclined his head. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped aside. Her sitting room was neat, lined with bookshelves and manuscripts. Stacked along the window-sill were copies of The Stranger's Secret, both the Courier version and the new hardback with Clara Fielding's foreword. "I've read them both," she said, gesturing to the copies. "Neither tells the whole story." Poirot sat. "Then you must." She folded her hands. "Langley paid me to maintain Halbert's archive. But what most people don't know is Halbert wasn't just publishing the book. He was writing his own version of it. Poirot's brow lifted. A rewrite? No. A replacement. He believed the real story was too radical. He feared it would inspire revolution, not in the streets, but in the libraries. He thought people would begin to question the canon. She handed Poirot a faded folder marked Alternate MS. Inside were pages written in Halbert's tidy cursive. In this version, Edward Linnell did not die mysteriously. He was discredited intentionally, cast as mad and exiled, living for years in an asylum under a false name. It was Halbert who gave the order, Eleanor said. Langley only followed it later. Halbert paid to have Linnell erased, yes, but not killed. He thought he was saving literature. Poirot frowned, and yet that part was omitted even in Clara's version. Eleanor nodded, because Clara never saw it. Poirot looked up. She thought she found everything, but Halbert kept this draft hidden. He entrusted it to me, told me never to release it unless the world was ready. And you believe now it is? Eleanor hesitated. No, but I think it's too late to stop it. Poirot closed the folder gently. Thank you, Mademoiselle Cartwright. You have given me the footnote to a very long chapter. Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot studied the documents for hours. A new truth took shape, one that neither Clara nor Langley had shared. Halbert had orchestrated the literary cover-up not merely to preserve his reputation, but to control the direction of cultural memory. He feared not only scandal, but change. He feared the democratization of literature. The man who had once published the avant-garde had, in the end, become its censor. Poirot penned a letter to Clara that evening. Mademoiselle, the story we revealed together was incomplete, not by deception, but by design. I now hold a chapter that speaks not of murder, but of memory. What shall we do with it? H.P. He sent it by hand. 3 days passed before Clara responded. She arrived unannounced, standing in the threshold of Poirot's sitting room, her eyes tired but determined. You found it, she said. Halbert's second manuscript. Poirot motioned for her to sit. She did. I always suspected there was something more, but I was so focused on vindicating Linnell, I didn't dig further. You gave the world a version it could understand, Poirot said gently, but there is still another truth to tell. Clara looked at the manuscript in his hands. It could fracture what we just built. Poirot nodded. Or refine it. She took the pages, turning them slowly, reverently. If this is printed, people will ask if we ever knew the real Linnell at all. Poirot said nothing, looked up. So what do we do? Poirot thought a moment. We publish, but not as an exposé, as a study, a supplement, the ink that remains, not the ink that replaces. Clara smiled faintly. And who will believe us? Poirot returned the smile. Only those who choose to read. A month later, a special edition of The Stranger's Secret was released. It included both Clara's edited version and the Halbert manuscript, annotated with commentary by Poirot and Sidney Grace. It did not sell millions. It did not spark lawsuits. But in reading circles, it became the subject of heated debates. Some called it a betrayal, others a revelation. A few insisted it was fiction layered over fiction, and the truth would forever remain obscured. But one line, handwritten by Linnell himself, echoed louder than any printed analysis. The truth is not what is written, but what survives the edit. One evening, Poirot received a small package. No note. Inside, a single old ink blotter, stamped with the logo of Halberd Press, its edges singed. He smiled, knowing exactly who sent it. "Dirter," he said to the fire, "is not the end of a story. It is merely the place where the reader stops reading. And somewhere, beneath London's quiet fog, another story prepared to begin." Chapter 9. The Last Line. It was nearly midnight when Hercule Poirot received the call. Inspector Japp's voice crackled through the receiver, tinged with something rare. "Uncertainty. We've had a break-in at the British Library," he said. "No theft, no damage, but someone left something for you." 15 minutes later, Poirot stepped into the marble atrium of the library's restricted archives. Two uniformed officers flanked the door to the special collections room, where Japp met him, coat-collar turned up against the London damp. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were going, Japp said, leading Poirot inside. "Security. Footage is blank from midnight to 12:17. Clean professional work." They stepped into the hushed, temperature-controlled space. A single object lay on the central display table, an original 1905 copy of Letters from a Lost Mind by Edward Linnell. The book was opened to the final page. Inserted between the last leaf and the back cover was a single sheet of paper. Modern, ivory cream, unsigned. Poirot picked it up with gloved fingers. The note read, "Truth, when buried, does not die. It waits, in silence, in ash, in ink. You solved the mystery of the last page. But did you read what was written in the margins?" Poirot folded the note slowly. "Someone is still playing." Back at Whitehaven Mansions, Poirot placed the mysterious note beside his files and lit a single candle on his desk. Outside, rain fell like whispers over glass. "George," he called, "bring me the Halberd file and the magnifying glass." As George set the items on the desk, Poirot opened the original pages from the Halberd manuscript and compared them to the version Clara had published. There were no differences in the main text, but the margins. A faint series of dots, barely visible even under magnification. Too regular to be age spots, too deliberate to be accidental. Morse code. Poirot translated slowly, character by character. Linnell did not act alone. The manuscript is only part of the story. The chapel holds the rest. Poirot sat back, stunned. "The chapel," he whispered. "Of course." 2 days later, Poirot stood at the edge of a forgotten chapel ruin in Kent. The one from the mysterious photograph mailed to him months ago. Its roof had long since collapsed, and ivy clung to its broken arches like aging scars. But something was different this time. Someone had cleared the overgrowth near the altar. A small square of flagstone, freshly disturbed, lay uneven. Poirot knelt, removed his gloves, and lifted the stone. Beneath it, a tin box rusted at the edges, wrapped in oilskin. Inside were brittle pages, yellowed with age, but intact. He removed them carefully. Letters, dozens, all signed E.L., Edward Linnell, written to a man named Desmond Vale. Poirot read, "They do not believe me, Desmond. They say I have lost my mind, but I know the truth lies in our notes, in the proofs, in the philosophy we drafted together. Halberd fears it will change the world. That is why he pays to silence me. Desmond Vale." The name rattled something in Poirot's memory. He flipped through older documents, financial records from the Halberd estate. One payment, long obscured, was made in 1952 to D. Vale for discreet archival services. A partner, an accomplice, or perhaps a second author. That evening, Poirot convened a meeting in his sitting room with Clara Fielding, Sidney Grace, and Inspector Japp. On the coffee table lay the letters from the chapel. Edward Linnell was not a solitary genius, Poirot explained. He worked with Desmond Vale, likely a fellow philosopher, editor, or friend. These letters reveal they were co-authors of a theory so dangerous, so subversive to the academic and literary establishment, that Rupert Halberd deemed it necessary to bury not just the manuscript, but the man himself. Clara read one of the letters aloud, voice unsteady. "The empire of ink they fear is not made of books, but of questions, of rethinking the sacred authors, of asking whether the classics are classic because they are wise, or because they are white, male, and preserved." Sidney shook his head. "That would have been career suicide in 1905. Japp folded his arms. "So Halberd and Langley silenced them, and someone's been protecting Linnell's legacy all these years." "Who, though?" "Desmond Vale." Poirot nodded. "Or Vale's descendants." He picked up the Morse-coded note. "I believe the person who left this, who orchestrated the drop at the British Library, is Vale's grandchild. They knew the game was almost over, but they wanted us to see every piece before it ended." Clara looked at Poirot. "So, what do we do now?" He looked at her gently. "We publish everything. The letters, the philosophy, the partnership." Sidney leaned forward. "Even if it means reshaping the image of Linnell once more." "We," Poirot said softly, "because the truth is not what we inherit. It is what we are brave enough to pass forward." 1 month later, the last line, "The Lost Letters of Edward Linnell," was published by Grace Fielding Press, with a foreword by Hercule Poirot. In it, he wrote, "This is not the solution to a murder, nor the unmasking of a villain. It is the resurrection of a voice, long ignored, nearly erased, now restored. The last line is not the end, it is the invitation to begin again." The book received mixed reception. Some hailed it as a historic correction. Others saw it as a dangerous rewriting. A few accused Poirot of politicizing a literary mystery. But beneath the headlines and reviews, something real had shifted. University reading lists began to include Linnell's letters. A once-forgotten thinker returned to the discussion of modern literature and ethics. And in quiet study groups, students debated not just what books said, but who had been silenced so others could speak. Poirot kept one copy of the last line for himself, shelved between a rare poetry collection and a monograph on ancient justice. On the flyleaf, he inscribed a single sentence in ink. "May the last line never be the final one." The mystery of the last page was solved. But Poirot, ever the reader, knew better than to close the book. Poirot, ever the reader, knew better than to close the book. Chapter 10. Curtain Callet was the sort of evening that belonged to endings. The lamplight in Whitehaven Mansions glowed gently over rows of books like footlights on a quiet stage. Hercule Poirot sat by the hearth, a well-folded newspaper on his lap, and a small leather-bound journal resting beside his cup of tisane. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the weight of revelations, but within Poirot's world the case had ended, not with handcuffs or declarations of guilt, but with publication, confession, and the restoration of a voice long silenced. And yet, as with all great mysteries, it was not victory he savoured, it was understanding. The release of the last line, the lost letters of Edward Linnell, had caused no riots, no immediate upheaval, but in universities, libraries, and quiet corners of intellectual circles, it sparked 1,000 questions. Desmond Vale, once a ghost, had been reassembled in the minds of historians, and Edward Linnell, once framed as mad, erased, dismissed, now stood reborn as a philosopher of radical clarity, decades ahead of his time. But truth, Poirot knew, is not a perfect equation. In the days following the book's publication, Clara Fielding had received both accolades and threats. Anonymous letters condemned her for unearthing ideological propaganda, while others praised her bravery for challenging the canon. Sidney Grace, ever the tactician, had managed the storm with public grace and private weariness. And Poirot, he watched. On the 1st of the month, he was invited to speak at a symposium at Oxford, Literature and the Silenced Voice, the Linnell Legacy. He declined. Instead, he wrote a letter, which was read aloud by Clara. In the matter of justice, the detective's task is often seen as arrest, but sometimes justice is not punishment, it is restoration, not of law, but of dignity. In this case, my work was not to convict, but to reveal. What you do with that revelation is your responsibility, not mine. Hercule Poirot was received with a standing ovation. Weeks passed. Life resumed its rhythm. Poirot spent his mornings in quiet contemplation, and his evenings rereading Linnell's original notes. He was particularly fond of a passage from a letter to Desmond Vale. The great lie of authorship is that the book is the end of thought, but writing is only the beginning. The reader is the one who finishes the sentence. Poirot would pause over that line often, fingers resting lightly on the page. It reminded him of why this mystery had haunted him so deeply. It had not been about a murder or a theft, but about something subtler. The erasure of an idea, the silencing of a voice not with a weapon, but with a mission. That, he realized, was a crime too. One morning George entered the room with a letter. Poirot recognized the handwriting immediately. Delicate, intelligent, precise. Clara. Inside was a note and an invitation. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I am leaving England. I've accepted a post in New York. An archival project centered around lost philosophical manuscripts. It seems I've developed a taste for exhuming forgotten minds. Before I go, I've arranged a private farewell gathering at Halbert House. You are, of course, expected. Yours, always in inquiry, Clara. Poirot smiled softly. Halbert House stood unchanged. The grand Georgian facade bore the same stern windows and weathered stone, but tonight it held warmth. Dozens of familiar faces had gathered. Academics, writers, readers, even Jap in an uncomfortable tie. Sidney Grace, standing near the piano, raised a glass as Poirot entered. To the man who proved that literature is no less a battlefield than a crime scene, he said, and to Clara, for never fearing the blood on the page. Poirot inclined his head with modest amusement. "It is the detective's role," he replied, "to tidy up after the authors." There was laughter, but beneath it a reverence. Clara approached. She wore a dark green dress, simple, elegant, eyes alight with both excitement and the weight of goodbye. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said. "And miss the final act?" Poirot replied, "Never." They strolled together into the old library, where the first fragments of Linnell's work had been discovered. "I'll miss this place," Clara said. Poirot studied the shelves. "The house may remain, but the chapter has turned. What you take with you, that is what matters." She nodded slowly, then reached into her bag and pulled out a thin booklet. "What is this?" Poirot asked. "Something new," she said. "Or rather, something next. A collection of essays inspired by Linnell's letters, written by students from around the world. No edits, no interference, just their voices responding." Poirot opened it. The first essay was titled "Truth in the Margins, Reading Against the Grain." "Your own legacy has begun," he said. She met his eyes. "So has yours." That night, as Poirot returned home, he found another envelope waiting on his hall table. No stamp, no postmark, hand-delivered. Inside, a final letter, unsigned. "There are those who say detectives deal in facts, but some truths are not provable. Some must be felt, weighed in the heart rather than the courtroom. You found the last page. You saw the erased lines, but most importantly, you listened. Thank you for giving us back our story." Beneath it, a single pressed lily, the same kind from the chapel. Poirot folded the letter gently and placed it within the final volume of Linnell's letters. He closed the book with quiet reverence. In the days that followed, the world moved on as it always did. New headlines, new stories. But somewhere in libraries, in university halls, and in readers' hands, Edward Linnell spoke again. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as an author, a thinker, a human being. And Hercule Poirot, he remained at Whitehaven Mansions, sipping his tisane, watching the fire. The great detective of logic, of order, of symmetry, content at last that sometimes the greatest mystery was not who, but why, and that the most powerful truth was the one we almost didn't hear.